Okay, I'm going to go ahead and get started here in a minute. Maybe. If people cooperate. This is all going on the internet, so you know. Yeah, I've started recording. So we'll see how long it takes people to notice. Yeah. You weren't supposed to tell people.
Oh yeah.
I wanted like 10 minutes of people talking on the internet. At least everybody will know we like each other. Everybody's talking. It's like they like each other. So, when we get started in just a minute, and it will be just a minute, we're going to be starting with Psalm 43 in the Orthodox Study Bible, Psalm 44 otherwise. I know you were gone a few weeks and you missed like 2 Psalms. That's about the pace we've been going. The sons of Korah, remember those genealogies in Ezra and in Nehemiah? The sons of Korah were part of that family line of the chanters and singers in the temple. Yeah, 43 the Orthodox Study Bible, 44 otherwise. And that's why here, this psalm is from the period of the exile and after the exile, as we'll see when we start reading it. But that's why it's attributed to them for their use in the temple. I'm going to again give my introduction, which is my Psalms introduction was long. I gave it twice. I got bored with it, so I can only imagine how you felt. But it's recorded and it's on the website. If you listen to either of the first 2 Bible studies on Psalms, I went through it twice. The second time is a little shorter than the first time, so if you want the capsule review, listen to the beginning of the second one. If you need something to put you to sleep, or you have a lot of time to kill on a long drive, then you can listen to the first one and get the full effect. So that said, unless anybody has any questions left over from last time or anything else they wanted to bring up, we'll go ahead and get started with Psalm 43, Orthodox Study Bible, 44 otherwise. And we already just mentioned what the description of the sons of Korah is about. We'll start. So God, we heard with our ears, our fathers proclaimed it to us, the work you performed in their days and days of old. Your hand utterly destroyed the nations and you planted them. You afflicted and cast out peoples. For they did not inherit the land with their sword, and their arm did not save them, but it was your right hand and your arm and the light of your countenance, because you took pleasure in them. You yourself are my King and God, who commands salvation for Jacob. In you we shall push back our enemies, and in your name we shall scorn those who rise up against us. For I will not hope in my bow, and my sword will not save me. For you saved us from those who afflict us, and you disgraced those who hate us. We shall praise God all day long, and we shall give thanks to your name forever. So that's the first piece of this psalm, and it's going to pivot here in a second into the second half. But the first half is basically going back and recounting what God did in the past. And remember, that was in Deuteronomy, that was the big main commandment was you need to teach these things to your children. Right? And then they need to teach them to their children, and they need to teach them to their children. Right? So this is, as I said, a psalm from the time of the exile. So it's been a long time, but at least the person who wrote this psalm, he got the message. Right? He got the message. And the message was not just what God did for them, but notice that he sort of reiterates several times that it was God who did it for them. Right? It wasn't that Israel went and conquered all these cities and conquered all these Canaanite peoples and put them to flight. It's God drove the people out and gave it to them. Right? So he's saying, you did it. And he's praising God for having done it and saying that he's trusting in God. Well, now, as I said, since the person writing this is writing this after Israel's been cast out of the land, now the psalm pivots a little bit. He talks about where he is now. Verse 10, but now you rejected and disgraced us, and you will not go out with our armies. You turned us back from our enemies, and those who hate us took spoil for themselves. You gave us as sheep to be eaten, and you scattered us among the nations. You bound your people without honor, and there was no abundance given to ransom them. You made us a reproach to our neighbors, and a scorn and derision to those around us. You made us a byword among the nations, and a shaking of the head among the peoples. All day long my disgrace is before me, and the shame of my face covers me. Because of the voice of him who reviles and chatters, because of the face of the enemy and persecutor. All these things came upon us, but we have not forgotten you, and we did not act unjustly with your covenant. Our heart did not draw back, yet you turned our steps from your way. You humbled us in a place of affliction, and the shadow of death covered us. If we forget the name of our God and spread out our hands to a foreign god, would not God search this out? For he knows the secrets of the heart. For your sake we are put to death all day long. We are counted as sheep for the slaughter. Awake, why do you sleep, O Lord? Arise and do not reject us to the end. Why do you turn away your face and forget our poverty and our affliction? For our soul was humbled to the dust, and our belly was joined to the ground. Arise, O Lord, help us and redeem us for your name's sake. Now, last verse you may recognize, that's one of the Prokimenon verses we use. It's in actually the cycle, we use it in Matins. Arise, O Lord, help us and redeem us for thy name's sake. So the main thrust here is what? It's God, when we had it good, it was because you gave us good. Now we have it bad, right? And it's because you've given us bad. But the important thing that the psalmist is calling for the people who are going to pray this with him and sing this with him, is that they haven't turned their back on God because of it. Right? One could have interpreted the exile a very different way. Right? You could have said, well, supposedly I heard all this stuff from my parents about how God came and gave us this land and drove out all these nations and defeated all these people, But now I'm sitting here in Babylon as a slave, Clearly it was all wet, right? The gods of Babylon must be more powerful gods, right? Because they won. They destroyed us. They burned down our God's temple, right? So maybe we should go worship Marduk and go worship the Babylonian gods, right? And he's expressly saying, verse 21, if we forget the name of our God and spread out our hands to a foreign god, would not God search us out? He's saying, we're not doing that. Right? We're not doing that. That's the opposite of what we're doing. We know, because of what God did for us before, that if we're going to get out of this mess, it's going to be because God brings us out of this mess. That it isn't that God failed somewhere. It's that God has sent us into exile, just as he brought us into the land. And so he could bring us into the land again. And there's one of the Prokimenon verses we use before the epistle readings. Right? A lot of times I've seen it, and our diocese, to its credit, in our liturgical forms, doesn't do this to it. But what the verse literally says is, God, you are just in all that you have done to us. Right? And a lot of times I've seen in other liturgical books and stuff, they'll retranslate that as all you have done for us. Right? Because, that's kind of putting a more positive spin on it. Right? But that's not what the verse says. What the verse says is, God, you are just in all you have done to us. Meaning the bad stuff that's happened to us, right? The bad stuff you sent our way, you were right to do it. Right? You were right to do it. We accept it. It's very different. It's easy to say, yeah, God, thanks for all the nice stuff you do. Thanks for my car. Thanks for my, thanks for my family. When things are going good, right? When we run into trouble, and it's generally because of our sin that we run into real trouble, right? Looking at God in those times and saying, yeah, God, this is fair too. A lot harder. A lot harder. But that's what this psalm is trying to express. Right? That's what this psalm is trying to express. That yes, we've been humbled, we deserve it, and now God, we want you to deliver us from this. Right? And pledging again, we're not going to turn aside and support it. We're not going to just dump this. We're sticking with you, God. Stick with us. Right? Okay. And then that last verse, again, that I mentioned that we use as a prokeimenon, that has that reference that we've seen before, for thy name's sake. Right? Meaning, if for no other reason, God, save us for the sake of your reputation. Right? So that the Babylonians don't get a big head, right? And think that they've conquered you. Right? Okay, so Psalm 44, Orthodox Study Bible, 45 otherwise. And this, it's translated here in the Orthodox Study Bible, an ode concerning the beloved one. Well, there's several things there. There's this for the end again, which we've commented on before. But then concerning things that shall be changed. That's an interesting translation of it. What's there is actually what we think is a musical term again. About something being changed over. We don't know exactly what it referred to, whether that was what we would call a chord change or something. but something was being changed. But then at the end it says, an ode concerning the beloved one. Or just the beloved. Right? And keep in mind with the sons of Korah, this is going to become important. When you see that for the sons of Korah, it means this is one of those later psalms after the exile. Okay. And we'll see in a second why that's important to know. So my heart overflowed with a good word. I tell my works to the king. My tongue is the pen of a swift-writing scribe. You are more beautiful than the sons of men. Grace was poured out on your lips. Therefore God blessed you forever. Gird your sword upon your thigh, O mighty one, in your splendor and your beauty, and stretch your bow and grant prosperity and rain. Because of truth, gentleness, and righteousness, and your right hand shall guide you wondrously. Your arrows are sharp, O mighty one, the peoples shall fall under you. In the heart of the king's enemies, your throne, O God, is forever and ever. Your royal scepter is a scepter of uprightness. You loved righteousness and hated lawlessness. Therefore God, your God, anointed you with the oil of gladness more than your companions. Myrrh and stacte and cassia pour forth from your garments, from the ivory palaces from which they gladdened you. Yeah, I'm going to stop there with that first part. So the first question, right, the author is saying, basically his little introduction, I've got a lot to say. He's writing an ode to someone. Okay? So, first question is, who is this an ode to? Who is he talking about?
Does he think he'd be talking to the Lord?
Well, he's talking to a king, right? We know that first of all. Okay. Now, when was this written?
After the time of the exile.
So there wasn't one, right?
Yeah.
There wasn't. So he's not writing it to. It's not a question of just whoever was king at the time. He's being obsequious and trying to get in good and say wonderful things about him. Right? He's not brown nosing. He's right? This isn't about some person who's standing. We're standing there in front of him. Okay. But now notice there's two pieces that go back and forth here. Right? So you have in verse 3, you were more beautiful than the sons of men. Grace was poured out on your lips. Therefore God blessed you forever. Right? So God is blessing this king, but at the same time, Verse 7, your throne, O God, is forever and ever. Your royal scepter is a scepter of uprightness. Right? But then it goes, verse 8, you loved righteousness and hated lawlessness. Therefore God, your God, anointed you. Right? And made you king. Okay? So, it's talking about God, right, and someone else, right, who God has made king to reign on God's throne. So I would argue that we're talking about Christ, right? We're talking about Jesus Christ. This is one of those psalms. We're going to get to another one that Christ himself quoted, where it says, "The Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand." And he's going to say, well, whose son is the Messiah? They said David's. And he said, well, okay, if the Messiah is David's son, why does he call him Lord? And they all go, they don't know what to do with it. Right? This is another one where you have God and this anointed king, but he's reigning on God's throne. It's not David's throne. Right? It's not David's throne is forever and ever. It's not, O king, your throne is forever and ever. It's God's throne is forever and ever. Right? So this person is at once God, but then there's also a God who's his God. Right? So this is one of those early passages where you get the idea of the Father and the Son. Right? Okay. So we're talking about Christ. And as a second note on this part, Father Scott probably noticed this, and nobody else probably did. But verses.
Now you're brown nosed.
No, verses 4 and 5.
Oh, okay.
Verses 4 and 5 probably looked awfully familiar to you and me.
Yes.
Or maybe not, because you don't wear it most of the time.
I don't wear it a few times a year.
But that is those verses are the prayer that the priest says when he puts on his epigonation, which is the
triangle that hangs.
The thing that hangs down, which
spins around and drives you nuts.
Drives you insane. Yeah.
It hangs around the road.
Yes.
That.
Yeah. And what that originally was a big pouch that they carried the gospel in. It actually originally had a practical purpose.
Now it's an award
Okay.
for sloppy.
Yeah, now it's just a piece of cardboard or cloth, and you don't actually carry around the gospel book in it. But originally, that's what it was for. And it was referred to as a sheath, like for a sword, drawing the analogy between the scriptures and Word of God and a sword. Right. Okay, and so that's why the priest prays when he puts that on, "Gird your sword upon your thigh, O mighty one," because that's where it hangs. Your splendor, your beauty, and stretch out your bow and reign. Grant prosperity and reign because of truth and gentleness and righteousness. And your right hand shall exalt you. Understand, you pray those verses at that time. Assuming that you don't have a lot of long, annoying ones that you don't wear. Okay, so that for this first part, we have this. So it's talking about Christ. Okay, it's important that we get that down, because now we're going to read the second part of it, and the second part is going to talk about another person. And while our Protestant brothers and sisters would agree with us, I think most of them, about who this first part is about, when we get to the second part, we're going to have a difference of opinion. But I think if we establish who the first part is about, who the second part is about becomes obvious. Okay? Okay, so starting in verse 10. "There are daughters of kings in your honor. The queen stood at your right hand in apparel interwoven with gold, and adorned and embroidered with various colors." Okay, I'll stop right there. Now remember, we talked about how when we were going through the kings, there was this tradition, right? Who sat next to the king on a throne, starting with Solomon? His mother, who was the queen, right? Okay, so this would seem to be a reference to that, right? The queen sits in, like any king of Israel. Queen is at your right hand, right? Listen, O daughter, behold and incline your ear, and forget your people and your father's house. So this is now talking to this woman, right? We're now talking to and about this woman. Listen, O daughter, behold and incline your ear, and forget your people and your father's house. For the king desired your beauty, for he is your Lord. And the daughters of Tyre shall worship him with gifts. The rich among the people shall entreat your favor. All her glory as the king's daughter is within, adorned and embroidered with golden tassels. The virgins behind her shall be brought to the king. Her neighbors shall be brought to you. They shall be brought with gladness and rejoicing. They shall be led into the temple of the king. In place of your fathers, sons shall be born to you. You shall make them rulers over all the earth. They shall remember your name from generation to generation. Therefore people shall give thanks to you forever and unto ages of ages. Okay. So you probably already guessed where I'm going with this and why our Protestant brothers and sisters don't want to go there. So we have this woman, and let's be clear, look at verse 14. All her glory as the king's daughter is within. Okay, so now we have this person who is both the queen, right? Who, as we saw in Kings and Rabbinic line, is the mother of the king, who's also his daughter. Who's also his daughter. Okay? Well, who can that be? If Christ is the person we're talking about first, who is there who's his mother and also his daughter? Right. Yeah, there's no one else who that makes sense concerning, right? Who's both his mother and his daughter. Right? Okay. Now notice what they say. What they say about her here. Verse 13, the daughters of Tyre shall worship him with gifts, right? He's worshipped. Okay, Christ. The rich among the people shall entreat your favor. It's which is from him to your. Okay, right? So she isn't worshipped, right? But people do come and what? Entreat her favor. Ask her to speak to the king on their behalf, right? That's right there. Okay. We get to verse 17. In place of your fathers, sons shall be born to you. You shall make them rulers over all the earth. Okay. Who's that referring to?
Jesus.
Well, who are her fathers? The Theotokos, who are her fathers?
God.
The prophets of Israel, right? Her fathers.
Her
Her forebears. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, right?
Okay.
To the people of Israel. In place of them, right? Old covenant.
Yeah.
Right? Sons shall be born to you. Right? So she's the daughter, she's the end result of the old covenant. Right? And now she's the mother of the new covenant. Right? Her sons aren't just from Israel, right? Her sons are the rulers over all the earth. Right? All the nations. Right? And this is what's important. This is what's important about when Christ is on the cross and he says to St. John, son, behold your mother, mother, behold your son. Right? He's not saying, hey John, do me a favor and take care of my mom for me. Okay? How do we know that? Well, because Jesus had a bunch of brothers, a bunch of sisters, okay? And say what you want about, for example, St. James. Okay? Even the Jews considered him one of the most righteous men in Jerusalem after he became a Christian. Okay? He was not going to just let Theotokos beg in the streets. Okay? She was not in desperate need of financial well-being because, and secondly, Christ was what? Basically homeless. I mean, he was wandering the countryside. It's not as if he was the financial support for his mother and now was going away and so he needed new financial, right? That makes no sense as an interpretation. Right? Okay. So the sons that he's referring to there, one of whom is St. John, who was the only disciple who was actually there for him to say this about, because all the other ones were off hiding, remember? Right? The sons are these sons here. They're sons from all the nations, everyone who becomes a Christian, who comes into the new covenant. Okay. Verse 18, they shall remember your name from generation to generation. Right? The Theotokos herself refers to that. Remember when Archangel Gabriel comes to her, she says, henceforth all generations shall call me blessed. Right? And then finally, therefore people shall give thanks to you forever and unto ages of ages. Why is that important? That second piece there is very important. First piece, not very controversial with anybody who's a Christian, that the Theotokos is blessed. Well, yeah. I mean, she's blessed among women. She got to be Christ's mother. Well, obviously. Okay. But therefore people shall give thanks to you. It seems to me that's precisely what our Protestant brothers and sisters have problems with.
I give him thanks.
Is giving thanks to her. Right? Is, singing a hymn about her. Right? Giving thanks to her. Or as he said, entreating her favor. Right? But this is, I'm not making this up. It's it's here in the Bible. And I don't see, unless you read this whole thing from a Jewish perspective, and so you won't admit that the first part's about Jesus. Right? If you say the first part's not about Jesus, then I guess we could have a debate. Okay? But if you accept that Jesus is the Messiah, which the first half is obviously talking about, and which you pretty much have to accept to be a Christian of any type, that Jesus is the Christ, then this second half, I don't see another way to interpret it that makes any sense. Right? It's just there. Right? So it seems to me that biblically here, we can debate what's entreating favor and giving thanks and what's worship, right? We could debate about the finer points of where the distinction is. But that we entreat her favor and that we give thanks to her is pretty non-negotiable here. That's just what it says. And this is liturgically in the second half of verse 10, Queen stood at your right hand in apparel interwoven with gold and adorned and embroidered with various colors, is what we say, what the priest says when we're doing the protheses, when we're getting when we're doing the commemorations of the saints. The first one we do after we make the lamb for communion is we do the particle, the big triangle for the Theotokos. And when you put that piece onto the paten, you say that verse. And you put it on the right-hand side of the lamb, from the lamb's perspective. Stage right, I guess paten right. Right. Okay. So this is an important psalm. This is an important psalm, and it's an important place to take people when our Protestant brothers and sisters have questions about the Theotokos. Right? You'll hear a lot of people say, for example, well, there's not that much about the Theotokos in the Bible. There's not that much about Mary in the Bible. Why do you make such a big deal? Well, there is.
If you know where to look.
If you know where to look, right? And so this is one of the places to take people, right? And some of the places we saw, like with the Queen Mother in Kings, that we noted. And we'll note a whole lot of other places as we go, and even some in the New Testament that are right there in the New Testament that people tend to skip over. Right? That's a lot of people don't know that the Theotokos is in the book of Acts. That it's not that Christ rises again and she vanishes. She's in the book of Acts. She's still in the church when the church is getting started. But so this is a very important one. And like I said, if you take somebody through it, like I said, I'm hard pressed to find other ways to interpret it that make sense.
Well, who do they say that
be honest, I've never heard anyone.
Or do they think that's one of David's wives?
That would be my guess, is they would try to historicize it.
Yeah, because in this King James I have it, the little thing says a royal wedding song.
Yeah. But the problem with that is, we have this inscription for the sons of Korah that tells us that Judah had already ceased to exist at the time this was written. So unless they were writing it for no reason, right? Just like, hey, theoretically, right? And even then, there's those things that we noted. For example, the fact that this king is both God's anointed king and reigns on God's throne, which David didn't, right? Remember in Kings, it's very clear that the promise, or actually it's in 2 Samuel 7:14, with the promise that's made to David is your throne. Someone will sit on your throne forever. That's the normal way of talking about the Messiah in the Old Testament. The most common way is that he will sit on David's throne. Right? That he's this continuation of, or restoration of David's line. Right? This isn't talking about it. This is talking about God's throne. Right? So this, again, being a human king is problematic. Okay? And so then secondly, that runs into the problem with this being the queen who's the king's mother, right? And also his daughter at the same time.
That had the Jews all messed up, didn't it?
Well, and the final issue is wedding would be between a king and a queen who's his wife. But as we saw all the way through Samuel and Kings, every time we were in the line of Judah, not Israel, but Judah, right? It was, he became king, so-and-so was his mother.
Yeah.
Right? It listed every time. Because that mother became, in some cases, remember Athaliah, who was wicked and tried to wipe out David's line, but she was the queen mother. That's why she had power. She was the mother of the
And generally
of the king.
speaking, if you're following God, you don't marry your mother.
Yes, or your daughter. Either one. And your mother and your daughter are not the same person. Yeah.
I don't understand. You say Protestants. I mean, they say, I don't know anything about
Right.
Protestantism. What would their problem be?
They would have a problem. Now, I should say most Protestants, because very traditional Lutherans, this is not true of. There are Lutheran hymns to the Theotokos.
There are also Anglican.
And there are Anglican hymns that they carried over from before the Reformation that mention the Theotokos. So it's not in all, although those have fallen in both the Lutheran case and the Anglican case. In the United States, at least, they've fallen into a lot of disuse. If you go to your average Lutheran church on the average Sunday, you're not going to hear any hymns about the Theotokos. But they would have a problem with that. They have a problem with addressing. They consider any form of prayer or hymn singing or praise to be a form of worship, essentially. And you only worship God, right? Therefore, there's not this distinction that we as Orthodox Christians and that Roman Catholics and that traditionally, like the Anglicans and the Lutherans of the early generations after the Reformation made, where they say that distinction that we saw in verse 13, the daughters of Tyre shall worship him and entreat your favor, right? That there's this distinction between what we sometimes call veneration and worship, or paying respect and worship, asking for someone's prayers and worshiping them, right? So it's from my conversations, it's not so much they believe that you can't make that distinction, but what they would say is, well, sure, you can make that distinction. But they say, for the average person out there in the pews who's singing this hymn, do they understand the difference? That's usually the argument they use. The usual argument they use is, Yeah, but there's a whole lot of people out there in the pews who are just worshiping Mary. Because they don't understand the difference.
We should venerate her, not.
Right. And our counter argument would be, look at this passage. We owe veneration, we owe respect and thanks to those to whom it's due. Right? And the fact that some people take that to weird extremes or do that the wrong way doesn't mean we don't do it at all. Right? The fact that something gets abused doesn't mean you stop doing it. Right? That was the position that, for example, Martin Luther himself took. Right? He was just as plain about how medieval Roman Catholicism abused the Theotokos as anyone else. But he said, just because they abused it doesn't mean we don't do it. We just need to do it correctly. Right? And so some of those nuances got lost on later generations in Protestants.
Well, I think you, as a Protestant, I think you hit the nail on the head, is the abuse of the veneration of the Blessed Virgin. And basically, as a Protestant, you know, when you come into that dialogue, and we look at Rome, who's our arch enemy, okay, if you look at it that way, then it's considered a worship of an idol, if you will.
Yeah.
Okay? And as far as the Orthodox are concerned, the icons, I don't think many Protestants are well educated or well schooled the significance of an icon. Therefore, when you look at the crosses, and then you look what are some of the crosses? Well, you have the Blessed Virgin on it, okay? And the Protestants really get a little paranoid about this, okay? Because of all that they went through in the Reformation,
Yeah.
and also especially, from Henry VIII becoming one of his titles, Defender of the Faith.
Yeah.
The Pope gave that to him, and then all of the bloodshed in England
Yeah.
of taking over the throne. So there's a steep history here
Yeah.
of this Protestant, and I can understand like both sides of that.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, that's an important historical note, that it's not really part of the history of the Orthodox Church in the way it is the history in the West. Most Orthodox people, I don't think, know what the 30 Years' War was. Like cradle Orthodox people know what the 30 Years' War was. The 30 Years' War took place in Europe, and it was a war between Catholics and Protestants, and it killed about a third of the population of Europe. Okay, millions of people were slaughtered, fighting over Protestantism versus Roman Catholicism. Okay, so a lot of things, the Enlightenment came out of that. I mean, a lot of cultural movements came out of that. But so, even though for us, right, we might not understand why, and this is true of most of my Dutch relatives, why a Protestant person sees something that seems to them Roman Catholic and is sort of, reacts sort of violently to it.
Very knee-jerk.
It's because of that. It's because of that history, right? It's because I'm standing here making these fine intellectual distinctions between worship and veneration. Well, a couple hundred years ago, people were slaughtering each other over this stuff, right? So to them, it's a serious issue, and it's an issue of identity. Part of what makes us Protestant is that we don't venerate, the Theotokos, and that's part of what makes them Roman Catholic and bad, is that they do. And so then when you come to the Orthodox Church, which is this third thing, you sort of don't know what to do with it. Right? It's like, that seems Catholic, and so I kind of push back at it, but it's different than the Roman Catholic Church. So
They even seem squeamish about the sign of the cross.
Yeah.
As well. Even though
Lutherans and Anglicans, yeah.
and even outward signs, they don't like that. Even
Yeah.
I've heard that even what's the other Protestant group that you're about?
Oh, Calvinists?
Calvinists.
Yeah.
I've heard even the Calvinists.
There were some of the Continental, yeah.
They did.
Yeah.
Some.
Yeah, so those things, those differences, where they started out, Martin Luther himself, and then would see these nuances and stuff, it sort of became entrenched. when you had these wars and things breaking out, where it was, we're going to move even farther over here, and we're going to move even farther over here, because we're at war with each other. But yeah, so that's a lot of why. But it has to be taken seriously because it's one of the biggest. I've never talked to a Protestant person who was interested in the Orthodox Church for whom this wasn't an issue. At some level. Some of them it's a huge issue, some of them it's a little issue, but it's always on the list of, I don't know how I feel about this. Right? And so, from that perspective, again, that's why passages like this are important. Where you can go and say, number one, this whole worship versus veneration, this isn't something we made up. Right? This is something that's in the scriptures. That giving homage and thanks to the Theotokos is something that's in the scriptures. It isn't something we made up. It isn't, I've heard all kinds of weird theories. Like that this is how goddess worship made its way into Christianity. Right? And all kinds of things like that historically aren't true, but people think that. And so showing them, no, this comes from the scriptures. Right? That early Christians started doing this because of what they found in the scriptures. Showing them that is really, being able to show them that is really important.
Yes, and this is one explanation is fairly tame from a Protestant background. Of course, for me, one of the toughest things to sit through and listen to was the Counsel of the Theotokos. Most Holy Theotokos, save us.
Yeah.
Protestants hear that right off the bat. Whoa, wait a minute. Jesus saves us. What's this guy? And it just, I had to grit teeth even to get through it. And it wasn't until years even after I converted to Orthodoxy that I become comfortable now with the Counsel, which is a very beautiful hymn now. But man, I'll tell you, it's foreign to Protestant thinking.
Yeah, the Counsel is sort of the extreme. Yeah. So if you want to do baptism by fire, you put a Protestant and say,
if you want to drive about the door,
if you can get to the point where you can handle this, you can handle everything we say.
Okay, I don't interpret that word "save." I don't want to get into trouble.
So that's again, it's why this is important, because this isn't some weird traditions or something that are outside of the Bible. This comes right out of the scriptures. And this whole thing with the king's mother, we saw it all through the history of Israel. This isn't some crazy thing where some people decided they wanted to worship Mary too, right? It's not that at all. Does anybody have any other questions about?
It up sacraments, how the Holy Spirit can work through things.
We'll get to that in a little bit. There's actually a couple Psalms from now. We'll get into that.
Okay.
This promise will pay off. Now, I can't guarantee we're going to get through 2 more Psalms tonight. But in a couple of Psalms, we will get to it. Okay, Psalm 45, Orthodox Study Bible, 46 otherwise. God is our refuge and power, a help in afflictions that severely befall us. Therefore we will not fear when the earth is troubled, and when the mountains are removed into the hearts of the sea. Their waters roared and were troubled, the mountains were troubled by his might. The torrents of the river gladden the city of God. The Most High sanctified his tabernacle. God is in her midst, she shall not be shaken. God shall help her early in the morning. The nations were troubled, kingdoms fell. He uttered his voice, the earth shook. The Lord of hosts is with us. The God of Jacob is our protector. Come behold the works of the Lord, the wonders he wrought on the earth. When he makes wars cease to the ends of the earth, he will break the bow and shatter the weapon. Then he will burn up the shields in the fire. Be still and know that I am God. I will be exalted among the nations. I will be exalted in the earth. The Lord of hosts is with us. The God of Jacob is our protector.
Wow.
Now again, first thing to notice, we have that Sons of Korah inscription. Okay. Again, lot of people, I'll write this off. What makes this interesting is we talk about verse 5, the torrents of the river gladdening the city of God, the Most High sanctifying his tabernacle, God is in our midst, shall not be shaken. Okay? This isn't a hymn about how great and mighty Jerusalem is, because at the time this is written, there ain't a Jerusalem. Right? There's not a temple. Notice again here it refers to the tabernacle, not the temple. Just as a side note, remember when we were talking about Solomon and building the temple, how God gave the instructions for the tabernacle and didn't give the instructions for the temple. So this city of God that's being referred to here, and his tabernacle that's in it and that he's dwelling in it, isn't referring to the literal city of Jerusalem that's sitting in ruins at the time they're singing this. Right? They're talking about another city, which city we see show up in the book of Revelations, chapter 21, coming down out of heaven. Yeah. But notice, it's sort of in three pieces. The first piece we've talked about before several times about the sea and how the sea sort of represents chaos, right? Chaos and destruction, and how the mountains represent sort of the opposite. The mountains pretty much are the most ancient thing around, right? And they don't move, right? The mountain is there. You can't move a mountain. At least they couldn't. They didn't have earth movers and mountaintop removal at the time, right? So you couldn't move a mountain. These mountains are immovable. So when they talk about the mountains being picked up and thrown into the abyss of the sea, that's about the most. I mean, that's it, right? This is, the most horrible things you can imagine. Creation sort of coming apart at the seams, right? They're saying even if that happens, we're not going to worry, because we know that our God is still in control, and that his city, right? The second part, his city still exists. So this psalm is sort of almost defiant, right? Defiant against what has happened to them, sitting there in exile, right? You burned down a city, right? But the city of God is still there, right? The city of our God, where he dwells, is still there and is unshaken by anything you did, right? And nothing you could do, even if it was to this ridiculous example of picking up the mountains and throwing them into the ocean, right?
Is this where St. Augustine gets his title for his book?
The city of God? Yeah. Okay, and so and then the final piece is, and here's what we know God is going to do, right? Not only have you not shaken our God, but here's what he's going to do. He's going to put an end to wars. You're not going to be conquering any more cities, right? He's going to be exalted where? Not he's going to be worshipped in the temple again. He's going to be exalted among the nations, right? The whole earth is going to become his. But this is where St. Augustine, his famous, one of his most famous works was called The City of God. And he wrote that work when the western half of the Roman Empire was collapsing. We don't understand now what that's like, but imagine, if you would, okay, that we're still living here in Charleston, West Virginia, but that the United States federal government has collapsed and does not exist. The West Virginia state government has collapsed and does not exist. And there's literally just roving bands of looters running through the streets, breaking into people's homes, killing people, robbing them, right? Total chaos. That's what Rome and the surrounding area was like at the time St. Augustine was writing. Okay?
Rome was coming
The
apart.
barbarians were sacking Rome, and sacking means they're coming through and murdering, raping, and stealing. Right, through these cities. The government couldn't do anything about it, had collapsed. Okay? And what we call the Dark Ages that came out of that was basically a bunch of tribal warlords setting themselves up as little kings all over the place, where formerly there had been this great empire. Okay? So people are living through this, or trying to live through. The Christians are trying to live through this. Right? And so he writes this work, The City of God, talking about the fact that, just like in this psalm, the cities of this world collapse and fall, break out into chaos like this. But the city of God is eternal and is untroubled by all this. And so when you're dealing with these very real, no matter how horrible it gets, situations like, you need to remember that the city where your citizenship really is the city of God. That's above and beyond all this. And that the time is going to come where, in this last part, where God's going to put an end to wars, and to strife, and to pillaging, and violence. Right? He's going to rule to the ends of the earth. So this psalm is very much what inspired him to write that. To write that to the people, to try to encourage them to endure through those horrible times. Okay. Any questions about that before we? Okay. So Psalm 46, Orthodox Study Bible, 47 otherwise. Oh, clap your hands, all you nations, shout to God with the voice of rejoicing. For the Lord Most High is fearsome, a great king over all the earth. He subdued the peoples under us, and the nations under our feet. He chose us for his inheritance, Jacob's beauty which he loved. God ascended with a shout, the Lord with the sound of the trumpet. Sing praises to God, sing praises to our King, sing praises. For God is King of all the earth, sing praises with understanding. God reigns over the nations, God sits on his royal throne. The rulers of the people gather together with the God of Abraham, for God's mighty ones of the earth are greatly exalted. Now this is generally, we've already seen a couple like this, but this is generally interpreted as being prophetic. Now again, note when it was written. Right? This is one from after the exile. Okay? Even at the height of David's reign, could Israel say that they were ruling over all the nations of the earth? No. They're still having trouble with the Philistines next door, right? Let alone the Greeks, right? Let alone, the Syrians, the Babylonians. Okay? So this is prophetic, even though it's speaking in the past tense, right? It's prophetic about what God is going to do, and it's prophetic specifically of what of Christ's ascension. We've talked about this before with a couple of Psalms. The ascension, we're saying Christ ascends into heaven and is seated at the right hand of God. What does that mean? It doesn't just mean, oh, here's where his chair happens to be. Right? It means he's ruling. He's ascended in heaven, he's ruling over all the earth. As this says, God reigns over the nations, he sits on his holy throne. The rulers of the people gather together with the God of Abraham. And so it's these passages that St. Paul is picking up on when he goes out to the Gentiles and starts telling them about Jesus. Right? Because he reads what we call the Old Testament, what he just called the Scriptures, and sees, oh, yeah, Christ ascended into heaven and he's ruling over the earth. So what happens now? So now all the nations gather together with the God of Israel to worship him. Right? Which means people like Paul and Barnabas and Silas and John Mark who went with them need to go out to the nations to gather them in. Right? To become part of to worship Israel's God, to become part of the covenant now. So Psalm 47, Orthodox Study Bible, 48 otherwise. Yeah.
I'm sorry, I'd like to ask the question as posed in Psalm 45. Can you explain verse 6? God is in her midst, she shall not be shaken. And that verse where the rest of God shall help her early in the morning. Who is she?
She is the city of God.
Okay.
The city of God that's being referred to. And that's also, on that note, this is backing up a little bit, but when we sing about cities, and sometimes it gets retranslated in some of the hymns we sing, the Orthodox Church, right? Because some people think that when it says city, it means Constantinople. Right? We, your city, that's not what it means, right? That's not what they were talking about. It wasn't Constantinople. any more than Psalm 45 was talking about the physical Jerusalem, which was wiped out at the time. Right? That's the city. We, your city, offer thank offerings of victory to the Theotokos, right? It's us as Christians, as citizens of the city of God, not Constantinople. Because in 1453, just like Jerusalem in 586, Constantinople got wiped out. There's another city there now called Istanbul, as much as we don't like to admit it. Constantinople was wiped out. There's another city there now. Okay. So Psalm 47, Orthodox Study Bible, 48 otherwise. Great is the Lord and greatly to be praised in the city of our God and his holy mountain. Well rooted in joy throughout the earth, the mountains of Zion, the sides of the north, the city of the great King. God is known in her palaces when he helps her. For behold, the kings assembled, they came together. They saw her, thus they marveled. They were troubled, they were shaken. Trembling laid hold of them. There were labor pains like a woman giving birth. You shall wreck the ships of Tarshish with a violent wind. As we heard, so we saw. In the city of the Lord of hosts, in the city of our God, God established her forever. We pondered your mercy, O God, in the midst of your temple. According to your name, O God, so is your praise to the ends of the earth. Your right hand is full of righteousness. Let Mount Zion be glad. Let the daughters of Judah greatly rejoice because of your judgments, O Lord. Encircle Zion and embrace her. Describe her towers in detail. Set your hearts on her power and observe her palaces, that you may describe them to another generation. For he is God, our God, forever and unto ages of ages. He will shepherd us unto the ages. Okay. So there's a couple pieces here. It's in two parts, but it's focusing on, again, what we pick up from a few Psalms ago, this city of God. Now again, when it was written, Jerusalem was flat. Right? Temple was flat. So these towers and everything that are being described and being talked about, right, are not actual physical buildings that they're looking at and saying, boy, isn't this a great city? Right? This isn't civic pride, like go Cincinnati or something, right? This is talking about the city of God, right? And you notice this reference in verse 7. Right, we have all the kings of the earth, right, who all have their cities, their capitals, right? The kings of the earth look at the city of God, and what happens? They're amazed and they're scared, right? They wonder at it, they're frightened because of how great it is compared to theirs. But then there's this reference in verse 7, there were labor pains like a woman giving birth. What is this talking about? This is talking about, from the perspective of them writing this is saying something is about to happen. Right? Now, we know as Christians that the thing that was about to happen was more literally like a woman giving birth than they probably thought at the time. Right? That it wasn't just that the time was pregnant with possibilities. Right? It was actually Christ was born. Right? But that's the idea here. The idea is something is about to happen. It's not just that God's city is better than all these other guys' cities. Right? Our king's better than your king. Our God's better than your God. Right? But it's also, he's about to do something. And that's part of why they're afraid. Right? It's not only is his city greater and more powerful, but he's about to act. Okay. So Psalm 48, Orthodox Study Bible, 49 otherwise. Hear this, all you nations, give ear, all you inhabitants of the world, both earthborn and the sons of men, rich and poor together. My mouth shall speak wisdom, and the meditation of my heart understanding. I will incline my ear to a parable, I will open my riddle on the harp. What should I fear in an evil day? The lawlessness at my heels surrounds me. Those who trusted in their power and those who boast in the abundance of their wealth. A brother does not redeem. Shall a man redeem? He will not give his ransom to God and the price of his soul's redemption. And he rested forever and shall live to the end, because he will not see decay when he sees wise men die. Foolish and senseless men die together, and they leave their wealth to strangers, and their graves will be their homes continually, their dwelling places from generation to generation. They called their lands after their own names. A man being in honor did not understand. He was compared to the senseless cattle and became like them. Their road is a snare for them, yet afterwards men will be well pleased with their sayings. Like sheep they are put in Hades, death will shepherd them, and the upright shall gain dominion over them in the morning, and their help shall be made old in Hades away from their glory. Yet God will redeem my soul from the hand of Hades when he shall receive me. Do not be afraid when a man becomes rich and when the glory of his house is increased, for when he dies he shall carry nothing away, neither will his glory descend with him. For his soul shall be blessed in his lifetime. He will acknowledge you when you do him good. He shall enter the generations of his fathers. He shall not see light forever. A man being in honor did not understand. He was compared to the senseless cattle and became like them. Okay, this is kind of a weird psalm, as you may have noticed while I was reading it. But the central theme here is, this is part of the movement we've been talking about as we go through the Old Testament, their understanding of what we call the afterlife, of what happens after you die, right? So there's clearly this idea of Hades, right? Everyone dies, they go into the grave, they go into Hades, right? But wicked men and foolish men stay there forever, right? It says, their graves will be their, in verse 12, their graves will be their homes continually, their dwelling place from generation to generation, right? So forever, they're in Hades. Whereas, verse 16, the righteous man, God will redeem my soul from the hand of Hades when he shall receive me. Right? And then again the comparison, verse 20, he shall enter the generation of his fathers, he shall not see light forever. Right? Whereas the one who is righteous will see light.
The resurrection.
Right. This is where the whole imagery that we get, the icon of the harrowing of hell, that we have on Easter with Christ grabbing onto Adam and Eve, him kicking in the doors of Hades and by the, that's where this comes from, right? That's a sort of literal picture of Christ fulfilling this, of him redeeming the souls of the righteous from Hades, taking them up, with the idea that the unrighteous
Get stuck.
have already found their home. And then the second piece in this psalm is one that we've seen before several times, talking about people pursuing honor and wealth, and things in this world. They give the example, verse 12, they call their lands after their own names, right? Nobody will probably remember this, but back in 1 Kings, we had the example of Omri, who was King Ahab's father, right? And King Omri, even though archaeologically he's one of the greatest kings of the ancient Near East, there's about 3 verses about him in the Bible. And those 3 verses say he was Ahab's father, he was wicked, right? And the third thing about him was he purchased the hill of Shemer, which became where Ahab built the new capital of Samaria, right? And he named it after his son, right? So this is most likely a reference. This naming the land for them is a reference to that. What happened to Samaria? Wiped out, right? And Omri's whole line of kings wiped out, slaughtered, right?
I don't suppose there's a de Youngstown and
Not that I know of. No, we were really poor. But so that's the imagery. That he is sort of a picture of the wealthy and powerful people in this world, who have things named after them. That's all great, but when you die, and you go down into the grave and you go down into Hades, what good does that do you? Right? This idea, foolish and senseless men die together and they leave their wealth to strangers. You spend your whole life building up this empire, then you die and it gets left to who knows who. Maybe if you're lucky, your kid. But someone's liable to take it from them. Who knows?
Verse 3, please explain. Are they talking about two different types of men, both earthborn and the sons of men?
Yeah, it's a weird, that phrase that's translated earthborn there is a weird, it would probably be better translated as sons of Adam.
He's not talking about the sons of God coming down.
No, it's most likely a reference to Israel and to Gentiles. Because that verse, hear this, all you nations, give ear, all you inhabitants of the world. Right? It would probably be better translated sons of Adam and sons of men, plural. So yeah, that earthborn is a little, it's a little bit of a weird.
I thought when I first read it, I thought he was talking about the angels.
Because in the original Hebrew, Adamah means both earth, dirt, and the name Adam. Right? So it could be either. So earthborn, I think, is probably a weird way to translate that. Any other questions about that one? Okay. I want to try and get to Psalm 50, so we'll see how we do here. Psalm 49, Orthodox Study Bible, 50 otherwise. The God of gods, the Lord, spoke and summoned the earth, from the sun's rising to its very setting. From Zion in beauty's splendor, God will come openly. He is our God, and he shall not be silent. A fire shall be kindled before him, and there shall be a mighty storm round about him. He shall summon heaven above and the earth to judge his people. Gather his holy ones to him who establish his covenant upon sacrifices, and the heavens declare his righteousness, for God is judge. Hear, O my people, and I will speak to you, O Israel, and I will testify against you. I am God, your God. I will not find fault with your sacrifices, because your whole burnt offerings are continually before me. I will not accept a young bull from your house, nor he-goats from your flocks. For all the wild animals of the forest are mine, the cattle and the oxen in the hills. I know all the birds of heaven, and the ripe fruit of the field is with me. If I were hungry, I would not tell you, for the world is mine in all its fullness. Will I eat the flesh of bulls or drink the blood of goats? Offer to God a sacrifice of praise and pay your vows to the Most High. Call upon me in the day of affliction, and I will deliver you, and you shall glorify me. To the sinner, God says, why do you declare my ordinances and take up my covenant in your mouth? You hate my instruction and cast my words behind you. If you see a thief, you run with him, and you keep company with adulterers. Your mouth is filled with evil, and your tongue weaves deceits. You sit and speak against your brother and place a stumbling block before your mother's son. You do these things, and I keep silent. You think I am lawless like you, but I shall rebuke you and contradict you to your face. Understand these things, you who forget God, lest he snatch you away and there be none to deliver. A sacrifice of praise shall glorify me, and there is the way whereby I will show him the salvation of God. Okay, so there's three pieces here again. The overarching theme is set up at the beginning, right? And that's from Zion and beauty splendor, God will come openly. Where have we talked about that before in the Psalms, right? When God comes to visit, right? So this is talking about the day of the Lord, right? God's going to come here, right? And so, verse 4, he shall summon heaven above and the earth to judge his people. So why is he summoning the heaven and the earth? Remember in the law that we read, what did you have to have in a court case to win a court case against somebody? 2 witnesses. All right? So those are God's 2 witnesses that he's calling. Remember at the end of Deuteronomy, he said heaven and earth were his witnesses to the covenant, to the making the contract. Right? Now he's calling them. Now we're going to have a settling up. Right? And so he calls the heavens and the earth. Right? Who, like God, have seen all the stuff we've been doing. Right? Because we've been doing it in front of the heavens and the earth. And they're going to testify about what we've done. Notice also, this is to judge his people. This is to judge his people. What we talked about before, when I've talked about some of these, they're talking about the day of the Lord, talking about God's judgment. I've talked about how we're going to be judged by our works. And part of that we is that means we who are his people. Okay? A lot of times we like to think that the last judgment is going to be God putting all his sheep, who are all the Christians, over here, and God putting all the goats, who are all those people who don't believe in Jesus, over here. Right? That's not the picture that the scriptures give us. Right? In fact, the scriptures don't talk a lot about those people who aren't his people. Right? He's going to deal with them. He doesn't talk a lot about how he's going to deal with them. We just know they're going to be dealt with. Right? He talks a lot about how he's going to deal with us.
Yeah.
Right? Okay? The sheep and the goats, in the parable of the sheep and the goats, are both Christians. Or people who call themselves Christians. Right? So he's going to send his people to judge between them. Okay? And so then the other two sections of this hymn are him speaking to two different groups. Right? He's speaking to the righteous first, and then to the wicked. Okay? What does he say to the righteous? What does he say to the righteous? This is interesting because he says first in verse 8 that he accepts their sacrifices. Right? That's how we know that they're the righteous. Okay? It doesn't say, you've never broken my law, you've been perfect, you've never sinned. Right? He says, you're the ones whose sacrifices I accept. Why are they offering sacrifices? Because they've sinned. Right? Amongst these offerings are sin offerings. So these are the people, as we've talked about, these are the people who have repented, the people who are making honorable sacrifices to God. So your first question is going to be, okay, well, I want to be one of those people, right? I don't want to be one of the other people. I want to be one of the people who God accepts their sacrifices. I want to be like Abel and not like Cain, right? So what do I need to do to be one of those people? Well, that's what the rest of this second section is about. And what's the point he makes? It's not the sacrifices themselves that I care about. Right? He says, verse 10, for all the wild animals of the forest are mine, the cattle and the oxen in the hills. I know all the birds of the heaven, the ripe fruit. Verse 12, if I were hungry, I would not tell you, for the world is mine in all its fullness. Meaning, I don't need you to go and kill a bull and cook it for me. Okay? I created all this. If I for some reason wanted to eat something, I could go take care of it myself. Right? You killing animals in and of itself does nothing for me. Right? That's not what it's about. It's not about you performing the ritual right, or you choosing the right cow, or the right number of cows. Right? That's not what makes your sacrifices acceptable. Right? Verse 14, offer to God a sacrifice of praise and pay your vows to the Most High. Call upon me in the day of affliction and I will deliver you and you shall glorify me. So God wants a sacrifice of praise, right? He wants worship. Piece 2, pay your vows to the Most High. What does that mean? That means you keep your end of the covenant. All those commandments I gave you. Right? You're keeping the commandments and you're worshiping me. That's what makes your sacrifices acceptable. When you come to me and offer a sacrifice for those sins you've committed, I accept that sacrifice because you're worshiping me and you're seeking to follow my commandments. Right? So that's how you get into that group. We see once again when we get to the third section that this other group, these sinners, to the sinner, God says, right? Now the sinner, again, is not someone who's not part of Israel. It's not some pagan somewhere. How do we know that? Because the very first thing he says to the sinner in verse 16 is, why do you declare my ordinances and take up my covenant to your mouth? Right? Your pagan idolater out there isn't talking about God's covenant. Right? He doesn't know anything about it. That's not who this is talking about. Right? This is talking to us. Okay? And he's saying, why do you declare my ordinances and take up my covenant in your mouth? To put it in more modern terms, why do you go around quoting the Bible and calling yourself a Christian? Right? Why? That's what he's saying to the sinner. Why do you do that? Because, verse 17, you hate my instruction and cast my words behind you. Right? You go around quoting the Bible, but you seem to forget about it very quickly after after the words leave your mouth. What you just said, right? If you see a thief, you run with him. You keep company with adulterers. Your mouth is filled with evil. Your tongue weaves deceits. You sit and speak against your brother. You place a stumbling block before your mother's son. Verse 21. Now this is interesting. You do these things and I keep silent. Right? We do these things, we sin, and God keeps silent. And it says, so you think I am lawless like you. Right?
You agree with me?
So we think God must not care. Right? We go and do these things. God must not care. God must not be worried about these things either. Right? He must just, But then the kind of shocking part at the end of verse 21, but I shall rebuke you and contradict you to your face. That's not what you want to happen when Christ shows up to judge the living and the dead. It's for him to look you in the face and say, oh no, I'm not lawless like you. You were mistaken. But notice at the end, verse 22 and 23, what are the last things he says to the sinner? Not, therefore I'm going to crush you and smash you and you're going to get ripped to pieces and I'm going to punish you forever. Right? That's not what he says. Verse 22, understand these things, you who forget God, lest he snatch you away and there be none to deliver. A sacrifice of praise shall glorify me, and there is the way whereby I will show him the salvation of God. Right? God doesn't want the death of the sinner. He doesn't want to have to rebuke him to his face. He wants him to come back and be like the righteous, to come and offer the sacrifices, to repent, right, and to find salvation. Okay, so that psalm almost dramatizes what Jesus is saying in the parable of the sheep and the goats. Okay. So Psalm 50, Orthodox Study Bible, 51, otherwise. This is one of the most famous psalms in the Bible. We read it all the time in the Orthodox Church. All the time in our services. It's in every Matin service. It's in, I think, Compline. It's in Compline service. The priest prays it about 3 other times during the course of Matins and the liturgy and the proscomedia and everything on a Sunday morning. So we all have to pretty much memorize it. At least some version of it. So, and I have been around bishops who spot check you. I've been around bishops who they'll say it out loud. So you can make sure they're actually saying it. But this is a very, very important psalm. And as you can see from the inscription, this comes from that time when Nathan confronted David about what he had done with Bathsheba. All right, remember, David had Bathsheba's husband killed, arranged to have him killed so that he could take her for his wife. Nathan shows up, the prophet, comes before the king and tells him the story, where he says, there's this man who all he had in the world was this one lamb, and he loved it like a pet. He kept it in his home. It was the most treasured possession. And his neighbor, who was this rich man who had all these flocks and herds and everything, had everything he wanted, came and killed that man's lamb so that he could have it for dinner at a party with his friends. And David stands up and says, you tell me who this man is and I'll have him executed on the spot. Right? And Nathan points at him and says, you're the man. That's one of those great, So, and this is, we read in general the description of David's response, of repentance. Right? And even though he repented, he still had horrible consequences in his life and his family for what he had done that he had to accept as part of that repentance. But this psalm is the hymn that he wrote of repentance when that episode happened. And so this is pretty much, here in Scripture, the perfect sort of prayer of repentance and acknowledgement of our sinfulness. It starts, have mercy on me, O God, according to your great mercy, and according to the abundance of your compassion, blot out my transgression. Wash me thoroughly from my lawlessness and cleanse me from my sin. For I know my lawlessness, and my sin is always before me. Against you only have I sinned and done evil in your sight, that you may be justified in your words and overcome when you are judged. For behold, I was conceived in transgressions, and in sins my mother bore me. Behold, you love truth. You showed me the unknown and secret things of your wisdom. You shall sprinkle me with hyssop, and I will be cleansed. You shall wash me, and I will be made whiter than snow. You shall make me to hear joy and gladness. My bones that were humbled shall greatly rejoice. Turn your face from my sins and blot out all my transgressions. Create in me a clean heart, O God, and renew a right spirit within me. Do not cast me away from your presence, and do not take your Holy Spirit from me. Restore to me the joy of your salvation, and uphold me with your guiding spirit. I will teach transgressors your ways, and the ungodly shall turn back to you. Deliver me from blood guiltiness, O God, the God of my salvation, and my tongue shall greatly rejoice in your righteousness. O Lord, you shall open my lips, and my mouth shall declare your praise. For if you desired sacrifice, I would give it. You will not be pleased with whole burnt offerings. The sacrifice to God is a broken spirit, a broken and humbled heart God will not despise. Do good, O Lord, in your good pleasure to Zion, and let the walls of Jerusalem be built. Then you will be pleased with the sacrifice of righteousness, with offerings and whole burnt offerings. Then they shall offer bullocks upon your altar. Okay. Now you see, at the end there, it picks up on some of the themes we had in the previous Psalms. Right? For if you desired sacrifice, I would give it. You will not be pleased with whole burnt offerings. Sacrifice to God is a broken spirit, a broken and humbled heart God will not despise. Right? Where David's saying, if I thought what you wanted was for me to go kill 100 cattle and sacrifice them or do all these things, I would do that. Right? But he's acknowledging what God was saying in the previous psalm. Saying, I know that's not what it's about. What God is looking for is a broken and contrite heart. He's looking for repentance. Right? And this shows us, those pieces of repentance that we've talked about before, where he acknowledges that God's judgment of him is true, that he accepts the consequences of what he's done, right? And that he's trying to repair it. And we see him trying to repair it, when he says, I will teach transgressors your ways. If you forgive me, I will show that forgiveness to others, right? It's sort of the reverse of forgive us our debts as we forgive those who trespass against us. He's saying, if you forgive me, I will extend that forgiveness and teach that forgiveness to everyone. Right? And see that notice at the end. At the end, he says, where he said, you don't delight in burnt offerings. Right? You're looking for a broken, contrite heart. But at the end, he says, then, once he's been forgiven, he'll come and make the offerings. He'll come and make the offerings. And so this is, again, we talked about this before at one point, but part of how we understand the Eucharist, communion, that we offer. Right? It's not as if you can not go to confession and just go and receive communion and, okay, well, that's taken care of. Right? Came to church. I'm forgiven now. Right? It's we offer that sacrifice. Remember the language we had in the last psalm, a sacrifice of praise. What do we sing in the liturgy? A mercy of peace, a sacrifice of praise. That's what we're doing. Right? We offer that sacrifice after we've confessed, after we've been forgiven. Right? And God has given us a clean heart and a pure heart. Then we can come to the altar and give thanks to him for what he's done for us. Right? Not put the cart before the horse. Right? Does anybody else have any questions about that?
At some point, we were going to talk about the holiness question. You said another couple of psalms.
Oh, yeah, we're not there yet.
We're more than a couple.
Don't get the cart in front of the horse now.
I don't think we're gonna have time to do the next psalm, so let me talk about one other thing in this psalm before we end, because it's kind of important. Because verse 7 gets interpreted in all kinds of crazy ways. So
I was hoping you.
Yeah. For behold, I was conceived in transgressions, and in sins my mother bore me.
Here we go, original sin.
Yeah.
One more time.
Yeah. So the question is, what does that mean? First of all, is David saying that his mother was doing something inappropriate when he was conceived? No. That's not what that's saying, obviously. Okay, but a lot has been read into this in terms of when a baby is born, right? When a baby is born, what is the spiritual state of that baby? Sort of broad overarching terms, right?
Yes.
When that baby is born, is that baby innocent? Is that baby sinful? Is that baby the same as Adam was before Adam and Eve sinned? Or is he different?
Or is he now tainted?
Right? Is he tainted? What does that mean that he's tainted? What does, and then if God forbid that baby should die, what happens to that baby's soul? Right? If the baby's not old enough, if the baby hasn't been baptized yet, if the baby's not old enough to, right? So there's all these, and that's, with babies is where it becomes very practical, right? A lot of these questions, when someone does lose a child, that it's not just a theoretical question, right? It's a very real and pertinent question. So the teaching of the church, in terms of what this means, is pretty straightforward. Okay? We do, as human beings, inherit some bad stuff that we inherited going all the way back to Adam. Okay? There are mainly two main things. We inherit mortality, right? Remember, God created Adam and Eve. Them dying was never part of the original plan. Right? They died because they chose to sin. And God warned them. He said, you go and eat from that fruit, you're going to die. They went and did it anyway. They died. That we've inherited from, right? Mortality. All of us are, from when we're born, we're mortal. Right? We're capable of dying. The other thing that we inherit is usually called corruption. Well, what does that mean? Right? Corruption means that we're liable to suffering, disease. We're liable to sin, right? Meaning we can sin. Right? And most importantly, and I don't want to get too technical with this, okay, but there's a particular faculty of our mind that's called in Greek, and I'll write it in English letters, called the nous, sometimes translated as mind. But what it really is it's sort of a sense that allows us to see and know and understand God. And Adam and Eve, before they sinned, right? We read how they walked with God in the garden. Right? They could see Him. He could see them. Right? And they understood what they ought to do and what they ought not to do, and they did what they ought not to do. Right? We're born with if you imagine that this is like a lens, right? Our lens is still there, but it's extremely cloudy. Yeah, if you've ever seen, a person's eyes or an animal, be a dog or a cat that had really bad cataracts, and then the cloudy, it's almost white. It's like opaque. You can't see through, right? We're born with that, which means we don't always necessarily understand intuitively what the right thing to do is, or know who God is, or how to get there. Okay. So these are things we inherit. You're born with those. You're not born guilty of any sin. Okay. This goes against the teachings of our Roman Catholic and Protestant brothers and sisters, pretty much all our Western brothers and sisters. Okay. Because they would not disagree with this. They would say this is true. Right. But they would also say, in the case of our Roman Catholic brothers and sisters, that we are born guilty of the sin that Adam committed. That God doesn't just hold Adam responsible for that sin. He holds all of his descendants responsible for that sin. Okay. And so, from that perspective, mortality is not that we're just born mortal, right? Able to die, right? It's that because we're guilty of Adam's sin, God is going to give us the same death penalty he gave Adam. God is going to kill us at some point, okay, for that sin. And this corruption is not just this idea that we're liable to sin and that we can't see and know what we ought to do, and we don't have the knowledge of God, but that we are actually, the way St. Augustine put it in his Confessions, is that the only thing that kept him from committing sins as a baby was that his limbs weren't strong enough to let him do much. Right? He had stubby little arms and legs, so he couldn't do much. But if he had full-blown arms and legs, he would have been out there sinning from the get-go. Right? And our Protestant brothers and sisters are going to take this even farther. Okay, and they're going to argue for what the Calvinists call total depravity. Right? They're going to argue that everything human beings do is evil.
That's where the whole question of holiness
Yeah,
comes.
you're born evil. Okay, and so this is often referred to as original sin. That's what they call it, original sin. Now, I'm going to continue going through this a little bit, but I would advise, when you're talking to our Protestant brothers and sisters, and you want to talk to them about this issue, do not lead off by saying, we don't believe in original sin.
Yeah, that's not right.
Because I know someone who did that, and it didn't go well. Okay? Because they're going to say, what? Right, okay. Okay. But there are a couple of things that are important here. The first one is, and we're gonna have to get into this a little bit again when we get to Romans 5, because in Romans 5 is the verse that they hang this whole thing on. But this idea, God is very clear. We've already seen this through the Torah, through His law. He doesn't punish people for other people's sins. Right? He says over and over again.
He tells you that.
He doesn't punish people for other people's sins. Okay? So, that already there's a problem. Second, when we go back to Genesis, remember, this idea that us dying is the death penalty. Right? That God kills it. What does God say when He cast Adam and Eve out of the garden? He says, we can't leave them in the garden, because if we leave them in the garden, they'll eat from the tree of life and they'll live forever in this state. Right? They'll live forever in what state? Corruption. Right? They'll live forever in this weakened, sickness, suffering, all the things God promises aren't going to be there in the world to come. Right? Right? Imagine, there's recently a TV show with this premise. Imagine if the world was exactly the way it is today, but no one ever died. Imagine if a person who got a horrible cancer never died at the end. Just continued suffering forever. Right? That's one of those horrible things you can imagine. Okay? And so that idea, that being so, that's why God expelled them and cut them off from the tree of life. That's why God They should bring about their death, to put an end to their suffering. Right? It's not the death penalty, right? It's punishment, right? It's God putting an end to this corruption. Okay? So this then comes to the question about baptism. Okay? For our Roman Catholic brothers and sisters, they believe that when the baby is baptized, that the reason you need to baptize a baby is, the baby hasn't gone and committed any sins yet. But since that baby is guilty of Adam's sin, you have to go and baptize them to get that forgiven. Okay? Which leads to the teachings that I think is kind of horrible, that any baby who isn't baptized goes to hell in the Roman Catholic Church. Period.
That's true.
Period.
Been there, done
Okay?
that.
And so on a practical level, they will literally, sometimes when women have miscarriages, have baptisms for the
For the baby.
for whatever they can, That's a profound misunderstanding, I'd say, of how God works, right?
Well, they don't do the miscarriages as bad as they did, say, 25, 30 years ago when the baby was miscarried in a house.
Yeah.
The Catholic priest would be right there at the house.
Yeah. And they have been backing out, the whole idea of they've been backing off of it.
Yeah, it's
A lot.
It used to be. It was,
But that is still the teaching.
yeah, it's still a teaching
Right.
in the Catholic Church.
And their teaching is that the baby goes to hell not for anything the baby did,
No.
but for something Adam did, however many thousand or million, depending on your view, years ago.
They use the term limbo.
This baby goes to hell, and so they constructed this idea of limbo, this kind of the not as bad part of hell.
Not quite as bad as hell.
Yeah.
But it's a place.
It's hellish.
Whereas God brings, provides for these children.
Yeah.
But they're separated.
Yeah.
Somehow.
It's hell light. Yeah.
Hell like
It's where you go when God can't make up his mind.
They're punished lightly for all eternity.
You don't hear
I guess.
Catholic priests talking about this too much anymore.
No.
Try to avoid it.
But that's the idea. That's where it comes from. Okay, is this idea that God has to punish everybody for Adam's sin, whether it is or not. From the Orthodox view, right? We've already covered God doesn't punish people for other people's sins, right? And that this is what we inherit. So when we talk about baptism, right? We talk about what? We talk about the person dying and rising with Christ. Right? So they put off mortality and put on immortality. Right? So baptism is this. We talk about baptism as healing this corruption. Right? And the primary way that we talk about baptism is, and in fact, in the Church Fathers, they use this as a synonym for baptism, is illumination. Illumination. Being lit, right, or receiving light. Well, what's that referring to? That's referring to this. That cloudy lens. Right? Gets cleaned up and made clear. Gets cleaned up and made clear. At least for that. So that the child is now able to see God, to understand the things of God, to know what should do. Now, as we sin, right, as we go on in our lives and we choose to sin, and we actually sin, we ourselves, right? We've talked about before how, and we've seen in the Psalms, it keeps referring to the wicked man and the ignorant man, right, or the foolish man, the unwise man, because these things go together. These things go together. As we sin, as we do morally impure and wicked things, it clouds our ability to see God, to know God, right? And vice versa. Vice versa. If we want to come to know God and come closer to God, we have to purify our lives from sin. The two go together. Right? Remember in Deuteronomy 30, when it went through all the curses that were going to befall Israel when they disobeyed. And God actually put it that way. He said, when you disobey, here's all the stuff I'm going to do to you. Because he knew it was coming. But the last verse in there, in the Septuagint, says, "You will see your life hanging before your eyes, and you will not recognize it." And Christians have always interpreted that as referring to Christ. It's referring to Christ. That the ultimate result of all the wickedness of the people of Israel was that when Christ was there, Christ, their life was there, hanging on the cross. When Christ was there right in front of them, they were too blind to see it. They couldn't see who he really was.
The Philokalia refers to the things that blind us as thoughts.
Yeah, thoughts. Yeah.
Cloud our vision.
Yeah. Yeah, wicked thoughts. Okay, because that's because they're writing to monastics. So me being a non-monastic, I'm still at the actions level. They're at the level where they're trying to control their sinful thoughts. I still have to. I'm a few steps out from that before I get down to thoughts. But so.
I have troubles there too, Father.
But yeah, that's the. So that's the. So when David says, "I was conceived in sin and sinfulness, my mother gave birth to me," he means he was born in this state. That's what he's saying. He's saying, I was born already separated from you. Not as an excuse. Right? Not as, hey, well, what do you want from me? I mean, I'm descended from Adam. You already hated me when I was born. Right? That's not what he's saying. Right? He's saying, I started out separated from you, and then everything I did made it worse. Right? Talking about himself.
So is it possible that these little bees would come to inherit? Is that
Well, no, those come from our
or is
thoughts.
that from our own experience?
Our thoughts. We have to understand, we think about our minds like a closed box, right? We think about our head like our brain is in our head, right? And there's stuff going on inside there, right? When we think and that kind of thing. Okay, but that's not how ancient people, including the church fathers, viewed thoughts. Thoughts for them came from outside. Usually through your senses. But sometimes other ways. Thoughts come into your head. Would be how they would describe it. Okay? And so part of this corruption is that we're living in a world that's full of wickedness. Right? So we have things we see, things we hear, right? Things we have, and also demonic powers who come. So we have all this input coming into our heads that's sinful from the get-go. Right? We're born into that world. We're not born with this chunk of evil in our head, but we're born into a world where we're bombarded with all kinds of opportunities and temptations and evil things right from our birth. Right? That's part of this corruption, is that the world we come into is corrupt already.
Well, doesn't it also mean to the corruption of the flesh, simply because of the one that you made, the mortality? The corruption of the flesh is the aging process.
Yeah.
Of what happens. And that's, I think, one reason the Protestants say that the Lord has no need for the flesh because it is corruptible. Okay? The spirit is not.
Right.
That it can be destroyed.
Right. He was saying that the people who couldn't hear, he was saying that that includes the corruption of the flesh. And we're going to see St. Paul, when we get to St. Paul in a couple of years, he talks about the flesh. He's not talking about physical bodies. Right? It's supposed to spirit. When he talks about the flesh, he's talking about this corruption. He's talking about, that we now have what some of those are called disordered desires. Right? We now, part of this corruption is Adam and Eve, at least from the story, ate. They ate and drank. Right? But we now, in the state of corruption, will now eat until we get huge and bloated. and our heart explodes. And our veins turn to wax, and right? We'll eat until we destroy ourselves. We'll drink until we destroy ourselves and everyone around us. You know, Adam and Eve were told to go out and replenish the earth, meaning go and have children. Okay, well, we now have sexual desires where we want to go out and do a lot more than have a couple of kids, right? That we have to now control. So that's part of this too, right? The fact that these desires we now have aren't ordered the way they're supposed to be. Right? And so now part of getting things back in whack is getting them back under control. Self-control coming in. And that's why we do things like fast, sort of exercise that muscle of self-control. Those kind of things. So yeah, that's part of that corruption, is that we have all these things that are now out of control and pushing us in all kinds of wrong directions, or we're willing to indulge them to extremes that are destructive. Does anybody have any other questions before we go? Okay then. So we got through Psalm 50. Not our fastest night, but not our worst either. Was that 8 Psalms? Anyway. So thanks everybody. And Lord willing, we'll come back next week and try to do at least another 8. I don't know. We're now a third of the way through the book of Psalms. So there is a light at the end of the tunnel eventually. We will be on another book.
What does it say? The light at the end of